I want you to imagine, if you will, that you live during the life and times of Jesus, and you need his help. Maybe you or a loved one are dealing with a very serious, even life-threatening disease or disability, or perhaps even a case of demon possession. And you've heard and you've seen how Jesus has helped so many people in similar situations to you. So you decide to seek him out and ask him to help you. In that situation, where you approach Jesus in need and ask him for his help, how would you expect that he would respond? Well, based on the fact that he's helped so many other people, you would probably expect that Jesus would help you too. You would probably expect that Jesus would show you compassion and love and mercy. Well, in Mark chapter 7, at the end of Mark chapter 7, we see two different people approach Jesus, asking him for help. But Jesus doesn't respond in the way that we might expect. So the question is, how does Jesus respond, and why does he choose to respond in that way? Well, that's what we're going to think about this morning in Mark chapter 7. We're going to start this morning with Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Go ahead and open up your scriptures if you haven't already to Mark chapter 7. And right now we're going to read verses 24 through 30. Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Let's read those verses now. It says, "And from there Jesus arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of Jesus and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, 'Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' But she answered him, 'Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.' And he said to her, 'For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter.' And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone." Stop there for a moment. So in this passage, Jesus is going into the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is a region much farther north than where Jesus normally went around, in the regions of Jerusalem and Galilee. Tyre and Sidon was a predominantly Gentile area, but even the Gentile folks, people who had no connection to the Jewish hope of the coming Messiah, even the Gentile folks sought out Jesus. Jesus is approached by a woman who's from the area of Syrophoenicia. Again, this is a Gentile woman, but despite her religious and ethnic differences, she falls down at the feet of Christ, desperately begging him to heal her daughter, to help her daughter who has a demon, also called an unclean spirit. Now, this was not a terribly uncommon request during the time of Jesus. Mark has already demonstrated Jesus' power and authority over demons and unclean spirits. Jesus has already cast out demons many, many times throughout the book of Mark already. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus cast out a demon from a man who's in the synagogue. And then twice more in that chapter, in verses 34 and 39, Mark records that Jesus cast out many demons. We don't know how many, just a lot of them. And then we see in Mark chapter 5, Jesus cast out a legion of demons from a man, and he cast them into a herd of pigs. And then in chapter 6, Jesus gives his followers to cast out demons. He gives them the power to do so during what we call the limited commission. So again, this woman was absolutely correct in coming to Jesus for help with this problem, because Jesus has already demonstrated many, many times that he has the power and the authority to cast out demons. She knew that Jesus could and probably would help. But Jesus doesn't react in the way that she might have expected, in the way that we might have expected. Instead of going with the woman to heal her child, or even saying from afar, "Be gone, evil spirit," and casting it out. Jesus instead tells the woman, he says this in verse 27, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Huh? What does that mean, Jesus? Well, if we want to understand what that means, we have to remember who is in this conversation here. On one hand, we have a Gentile woman. On the other hand, we have one of the leading religious teachers of the Jews. These two groups didn't normally intersect. I think we also need to ask ourselves, who is the primary focus and target of Jesus' earthly ministry? Well, it was the Jews. Jesus' primary focus of his ministry was on the Jewish people. We spoke a second ago about the limited commission. In Matthew's account of that event, in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, Jesus tells his disciples only to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because they were the ones who should have been awaiting the coming of Christ, just like the scriptures had promised that he would be there. The Jews were the ones who had been in a covenant relationship with God. In this time period, if you were a Gentile, that means that you were outside of Israel. You were either a Jew or a Gentile. And the Gentiles had no connection to the coming Messiah, or really to God at all, unless they became a Jew. So when Jesus here in Mark chapter 7, he's talking about children and dogs, he's talking about the long-standing divide between Jews and Gentiles. In this analogy, the Jews are the children and the Gentiles are the dogs. And essentially, Jesus is saying he's not going to help this woman or her daughter because his mission and his ministry is focused on the people of Israel. He's going to feed his children before he feeds the dogs. Is that right? Did Jesus really say that? Did he really say that he wasn't going to help a worried mother or a sick child just because they weren't Jews? Does that mean that Jesus was racist? Well, that's the conclusion that a lot of people come to when they read this passage. When we look at Matthew's account of this event, in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus says, again, he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so people assume that Jesus is racist and refusing to help this woman's daughter just because they're a different ethnicity than he was. Is that the right conclusion to come to when we read this passage? Well, let's consider some other evidence and then we can come to a conclusion. Firstly, we know that Jesus, time and time again, either healed or positively interacted with people who were not Jews. We already mentioned in Mark chapter 5 how Jesus cast out the legion of demons. Well, that man was from a region called Decapolis, a Gentile area. We also see instances such as Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, where Jesus heals the servant of a Roman soldier. The enemy of the Jews, he heals a servant of a Roman soldier. We also can find the accounts in John chapter 4, where Jesus interacts kindly with the adulterous Samaritan woman at the well. So Jesus had love and compassion and positive interactions with people outside of Judaism. And we also know that Jesus was here on earth in the first place to die for the sins of the world. Not just a group of people, not just some people, the world. And we know this because the Bible makes it very, very clear in several passages. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, Paul says that God does not want anyone to perish. He wants everyone to be saved. Peter says much the same thing in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, that God does not want anyone to perish. He wants everyone to repent. John in 1 John chapter 2 says that Jesus died for the sins of the world. God doesn't want anyone to go to hell, regardless of what country they're from or what color their skin is. Jesus died for the world, died for everyone. So if Jesus was racist, as some people claim when they read this passage in Mark chapter 7, Why would he constantly help Gentiles and Samaritans? Why was he here on earth to die for the sins of the world? It makes no sense to claim that Jesus is racist. It goes completely against who Jesus is and what he did. So Jesus is not denying this woman or her daughter a miracle because they as Gentiles, they're just not worth it. They're not good enough. He's saying that his primary focus and target were the Jews. Because again, they were the ones who were prepared for him to be there in the first place. The Gentiles didn't have the background of God's covenant or the prophecies about Jesus' coming to earth. They didn't fully understand at this time why Jesus was on earth or what his miracles should have pointed them towards. Again, as we've already mentioned, Jesus died on the cross to save the world from their sins. This includes both Jews and Gentiles. But God's plan for salvation, God's plan for the spread of the gospel, of the good news, was that it was going to start with the Jewish people and then spread out from there to the Gentiles. And we see this time and time again in the Scriptures. At the end of Luke, Jesus says this. In the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, and then all Judea, and then all the world." Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that the gospel came to the Jews first and then also to the Greeks. It wasn't just one side or the other, but it started with the Jews and then spread out to the world from there. And I think perhaps that's one of the reasons that Jesus uses this analogy of children and dogs. If you only have enough food to feed either your child or your dog, which one are you going to feed? Well, as much as I love dogs, I think all of us would be in agreement that we would feed our small child first before we feed our dog. Jesus isn't saying that the Jews are more important than the Gentiles or that they're better than the Gentiles. He's simply saying that the gospel was to be first preached to the Jews, and then it would go to the Gentiles. Because again, the Jews were the ones who were waiting for Jesus to come. Jesus is saying the children will eat first, not that the dogs will never get to eat. And I think the woman understood this. This Syrophoenician woman was content that the gospel, that Jesus' ministry at that point in time was focused on the Jews. But she points out that even the dogs are allowed to have the crumbs that fall off the master's table. Right, if food is on the dining room table, that's for you and me. That's for humans. But if it falls on the floor, now it's the dogs. Because we're not eating off the floor. We're civilized people. The dogs can have it, but that's not for us. And so this woman isn't trying to upset the apple cart, so to speak, and rearrange God's plan of how the gospel was to be spread to all mankind. She just wanted Jesus to help her daughter. But the question is, why does Jesus make her go through this whole ordeal? Why does he talk about children and dogs and the spread of the gospel? What is the point of doing that? Well, a lot of people have seen what Jesus has done here as an opportunity for this woman to prove how strong her faith was that Jesus could heal her daughter. And I don't want to assume that that's exactly why Jesus did that, but I think that's a reasonable thought. In Matthew's account of this event, Jesus ends up praising this woman for her faith. Keep your finger in Mark, but I want to think about what Jesus said as recorded in Matthew's account of this event. Look at Matthew chapter 15 and verse 28. Again, this is the same passage in the Gospel of Mark, just recorded from a different perspective. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 28. Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. If Jesus' intent with this kind of ring around the rosy, if you will, was to test this woman's faith, she passed that test with flying colors. Mark says in Mark chapter 7 and verse 29 that because of what she said, because of how she responded to Jesus, the demon had left her daughter. And sure enough, when she goes home, she finds her daughter in bed, but no demon. The demon has left her. This interaction between Jesus and this Syrophoenician woman, it raises some eyebrows. Because Jesus doesn't respond to her request for help in the way that we might expect. He handles the situation differently than how we would have anticipated. But even though the process was different than how you or I would have expected or maybe wanted it to go, the end result proves that the process was exactly what it needed to be. The girl was healed, the mother is praised for her faith, and we are given an excellent reminder of how God beautifully orchestrated the spread of the salvation of Jesus to all the world. Jesus didn't do what we thought he was going to do. He didn't do what we thought he was going to do or how he was going to do it. But he did it exactly the way that it needed to be done. And that's also the case with our next passage in Mark chapter 7. And flip back to Mark chapter 7, and we're going to pick up in verse 31 and read down through the end of the chapter. Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. It says, "Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, and after spitting, touched the man's tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And the man's ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So in this passage, a man who cannot hear or speak is brought to Jesus in the hope that Jesus would heal him. And just like with unclean spirits, Jesus has already proven time and time again that he has the ability to heal those who are sick. And Jesus was willing to heal this man just as he healed the little girl who had the unclean spirits, and as he had done for countless other people. But the way that Jesus chooses to heal this man it's a little bizarre. Instead of just simply laying his hand on the mute man, or just saying the words, be healed, because either one of those ways would have worked, Jesus takes this man away from the crowd into private. And once they're in private, Jesus first sticks his fingers in the man's ears. And then he takes his fingers out and he spits on them. And he touches the man's tongue. Then Jesus looks up to heaven, he sighs or he groans, and then he says, be opened, which Mark records both in the Aramaic, which is how Jesus said it, and then translates that into Greek and now English for us for his audience. Again, we find ourselves asking, what is going on here? Why did Jesus choose to react and respond in this way? Well, there's been a lot of suggestions as to why Jesus did what he did here. And I'm not sure anyone really has a full understanding of why Jesus did what he did here. But we do know for certain that this man was healed because of Jesus. Mark records that immediately this man's hearing and speech were made perfectly, completely whole. And despite Jesus' command to keep this thing quiet, word spread quickly about what he had done, leaving the people of Decapolis marveling at who Jesus is. And they rightly proclaimed that Jesus does all things well. Jesus didn't cast out the demon of the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman in the way that we might have anticipated. He didn't heal the deaf and mute man in the way that we might have expected. He didn't respond the way that makes sense to us. But he did heal both of them. And as Mark chapter 7 and verse 37 reminds us, Jesus does all things well. Jesus does all things well. Friends, there's going to be times in our lives where we are wanting God to respond to us in a certain way. Or maybe we're asking for healing for us or for a loved one. Maybe we're asking for God to open a door in our personal life or our professional career. Whatever it is that we're asking for or we're wanting, God has no obligation to respond the way that we want Him to, or at the time that we want Him to. God can choose to grant our request, but it may be that He grants our request in a way that we would have never looked for, in a way that we would have never expected or anticipated. And maybe it's that He gives us the answer that we're looking for, but He doesn't give it to us when we're looking for it. Instead, He makes us wait a little bit. God isn't going to respond to our prayers in the way that we want, but He's going to respond to our prayers in the way that we need. Remember that Jesus does all things well. God tells us in Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, that His ways are not like our ways, and His thoughts are not like our thoughts. God says in that passage, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." God's ways are not like our ways. God's ways are better. We may have a plan for how we want things in this life to go, but life does not abide by our plans, and we should thank God for that. Because any plan that we make is going to have at least, if not more, but at least one fatal flaw. We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, or even if there will be a tomorrow. If it's His will, Jesus could come back today. And there's nothing wrong with making plans, but we need to remember that our plans are constantly going to get interrupted and adapted, and sometimes even abandoned. But God's plans never will be. They will never be interrupted or adapted or abandoned. David writes in Psalm number 18 and verse 30 that God's ways are perfect. Our ways are not perfect, but God's are. Our plans will never be as good for us as God's plans are. Again, there's going to be times in our lives where we expect God to react or to respond in a certain way. And God could do that. He could respond exactly how we think He will. But that doesn't mean that He will do that 100% of the time. Because God could respond in a way that we would never see coming. And His ways are perfect. So if He chooses to respond, He's responding in the correct way. God's ways are perfect and ours are not. And every day of our lives, every second of every hour of every day, we need to be like Solomon. As Solomon wrote in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, he says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Turn away from evil." We need to be able to trust in God. Trust in His ways. Trust that He does all things well. Unlike you or me. And we are able to have this trust, this firm, concrete foundation under us. We are able to trust in God because we know that His plans are perfect. And we have no better example of this than God's plan to save us from our sins. Paul says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 6 that at the right time, not too early, not too late, at the right time Christ died for sinners like you and me. God orchestrated the life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus exactly the way that it needed to be in order to bring about salvation to us sinners. And in order for any of us to receive God's free gift of eternal life, we must trust in His word and not man's. We must do what God has said to do and not what man says to do. So what has God said to do if we want to be saved? Well, Jesus says in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. If there's anyone here this morning who has not yet received God's free gift of salvation through the waters of baptism that represent Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, you can do so today. As we talked about a second ago, we don't know if there's a tomorrow, but we do have today. Today, you can have your sins washed away and forgiven by the blood of the Lamb when you were baptized and the waters of baptism that represent what He did for us. If there's anyone here today who needs to be baptized, or anyone here today who simply needs the prayers and the help and the support of this church family, you have an opportunity to let us know that by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.